Bonsoir à toutes et toutes, tous et toutes et toutes, and all the other ones. Je voudrais bien parler en français parce que j'habitais longtemps à Québec, au Canada, mais la formation intellectuelle était en anglais, même que je lis plusieurs langues. Et donc, alors, on m'a demandé à parler en anglais, mais si vous ne comprenez pas, s'il vous plaît, présenter un visage en angoisse et peut-être je peux improviser un peu pour supporter cette interprétation, mais sinon, peut-être vous pouvez dormir un peu, retourner quand vous trouvez quelque chose de très intéressant à voir. Et donc alors, la pensée féministe, ok, feminist thought, artworking, c'est pas un mot, on peut traduire, mais on va l'expliquer, and the critical humanities and the dystopic present. Now, is it, okay, so we begin with feminist thought. Okay, I am supremely honored to have been honored by the University of Geneva, as your dean has just explained. We all work away in our feminist little corners, struggling to change. Oops, I've done something totally terrible here. Struggling to change the world a little bit, and it's wonderful to have the support of so many women around the world and so much interest in the works that we have, as feminists, put into the world to nourish la pensée féministe. I'm also grateful to Giovanna Saperi, Professor Saperi, for her work in bringing about the translation of the book Old Mistresses, Les Maîtresses d'Autrefois, into the divine language French. This is really a wonderful feeling to read these words in a spoken French. So I thank you today for this hospitality and the opportunity to dialogue. My first image after this one, which we will see this many times, so don't be anxious yet. My first image, and in fact my second image, brings together my first major publication or intervention in feminist art history with the most recent one, which Professor Saperi has just mentioned. And I wanted to explain, in a sense, what happened between these two to be able to arrive at doing a work which is to honor a very unknown but wonderful feminist predecessor who represents precisely what I want to say today, which is that I shall indict the universities and the museums for depriving us, for effacing the long, long histories of feminist thought throughout the ages. So we keep having to return as if we've discovered something remarkable. Now, Helen Rosenau was, as Professor Saperi has said, an art historian of a previous generation. She was born in 1900, she died in 1984. And even though Old Mistresses, you can see, was published in 81, I did not know anything of her. She came to conferences of the art historians, but nothing in my education made me discover her or even imagine that she might be there. Now, the most important thing about Old Mistresses is it's not the fruit of an individual mind. It's the product of at least 2, if not 7 or 8. Here we have, and it's very sad to look at this picture because I just kept thinking, oh, how much time has passed and how one has changed. But here are 2 young women in their 20s, late 20s. We are there reading the proofs of Old Mistresses. And I want to stress the importance of collectivity in feminist thought and work. Now, we have to make this go up. Okay. Now, when we were sitting there doing this, we asked ourselves, why should we write another book on women artists? Because, as you may know, a range of books came out of the United States, but also indeed out of, now this is a problem. If I do this, oh, that's okay. You do that, okay? You will see, even in England, they came up with a book about women artists before Old Mistresses, but also in France. And I wonder how many people, even those who speak French, know about Françoise Daubonne, who was a feminist art historian long before I even began to think about things, okay? So why would we write another book? What made it different? I'm just trying to find this. So I want to start with a letter that Rosie wrote to me, because the collective of artists and art historians that we formed in 1972, called Women's Art History Collective, was made up of women who were teaching each other. All of us were orphaned or stranded in a history of art that taught us nothing about women, one or two if you were very lucky, and usually looked at with this kind of disdain, lack of respect if you even mentioned them. So during the time of the late 80s and late 70s, Rosie and I lived in two different cities, and we would travel at weekends to just eat a lot of chocolate, lie on the ground and say, I feel the weight of patriarchy crushing me. How do we think our way out of this? And this was real, it felt very physical. So she wrote me this letter after she'd been at one of our meetings, and she said, one of our meetings dealt with language. No, sorry, this is not the right one. I have to go back one. Here. Okay. I don't know if I can get it. This lovely letter, which I have preserved, and which is here. So, dear Griselda, driving home, I felt more and more satisfied with our final exposition of what we are trying to do. Looking back over all previous outlines, it strikes me that we have been fumbling towards what factors differentiate our perspective from Nochlin and El, the Americans. Each time we have met, a different aspect has been foregrounded, a different aspect of what it is that makes our perspective essentially political and to do with power relations, and theirs, i.e. the American version, is all to do with equal rights and sociological discrimination. Although we clearly have to incorporate these concerns as symptoms, not causes. So this, I think, is one of the points that frequently is overlooked, that in Maîtresse d'Autrefois, we disowned what we would call positivist American versions of art history, and little did we know that we were becoming structuralists. But that is the crucial difference between these two models. So what I want to start off with emphasizing is feminist co-creation and collaborative thinking, even if you haven't yet got your PhD. Neither, I didn't think I even had my master's degree at this point. Okay, so this is very curious. I'm sorry, we'll be less elegant as we would like to be. So the next letter, further on the letter, she says, our meetings dealt with language, the next identity, creativity, and then the 20th century relevance. But I don't think any of our meetings actually constituted a revision. That is why we must not abandon the outlines, but use them critically. The gap between contemporary acclaim of women artists and historical neglect encompasses so much that is daunting, that makes you unable to explain it. And I think we need to calm ourselves and protect ourselves. We shall have to treat each OM, each woman artist, in her own right. Now, this is, I think, very crucial. What answers does she suggest vis-a-vis her own society, career, etc.? Of course, we've said all this, but I feel so high on the sense of jigsaw pieces falling into place that I need to write it down. And I think starting with Genesis is nothing short of genius, because the relevance of talking about both art practice and images becomes immediately apparent in the terms of power relations in society. And what she's discussing is is that our first page included these two images. One is a poster from an American advertising agency, which has taken Michelangelo's creation of Adam, made the god a goddess, and the creation is the creation of Eve. But below is a lovely cartoon which shows the impact of feminism as early as 1972, because there is a very angry-looking feminist, you can see the one there with her mouth open and made to look very fierce, who says to the people around, I suppose you have never imagined that these could have been made by women. And she's talking about the Lascaux caves. Now, just last week, I read a really interesting article which said, by analyzing the handprints on the walls that these are women's hands, because apparently the relationship between the index finger and the third finger are different in men. So you can all sit there looking at your hands. But adolescent boys have the same hands as women. So they could have been made by young men. So young men, you know, teenagers can claim the creation of art, but I doubt they want to do that. Okay, so in the many editions and languages of Old Mistresses, we offered a structural analysis of an ideology showing why and how the discipline of art history has systematically excluded artists who are women. Now, this is an important formulation because les femmes artistes, or women artists, creates a collectivity. And what we were saying in the letter was we must not treat women as a collectivity. We must study each one in her singularity, because that's exactly what you do when you study artists who are men. They are the absolute symbol of individualism and autonomy. So we were trying also to establish that the denial and effacement of women as artists only occurred in the 1930s in museums. We can date it, we can see who actually did it. And in art history in the 1950s, so only in the 20th century, there is so little difficulty to research women artists because they are in all the dictionaries, Benedict, you know, all the, oh, they've gone out of my head, but the great Timo Becker, it's not, and they are absolutely ubiquitous in any auctioneer's catalogs all the way through the 19th century. So Feminist Anguissola was so famous that any painting of an Italian or Spanish nobleman was attributed to her. And so we've had to do all this work of digging out which ones were just what the auctioneer said, call it Anguissola and she'll sell. So I think this is crucial because otherwise you labor under the idea that we are rediscovering artists who have been hidden forever. It's a 20th century phenomenon, and the major people who said no women, and they said it overtly in the presence of women, are people like Alfred H. Barr and Ernst Gombrich and Hans, whatever his name is, H.W. Jansen, right? So as you can see, well, you can't see because we haven't got there. Women in Art was published in the actual little booklet in 1944, that's to say 6 years before Gombrich wrote The Story of Art, with lots and lots of women. So I think these are the major discoveries of Old Mistresses. Now, we also found ourselves inspired by Mary Ellman, an American literary critic, to analyze the language in which this evacuation took place. Because sometimes you have to mention people in order to degrade them from the sort of rank of great artists. So there is no lack of these throwaway remarks in these books to say, oh yes, there was Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, but she was feeble, decorative, unimaginative, a follower, nothing important. So there is a critical stereotype of using this language repeatedly to find fault with what every woman does in terms of a feminine stereotype, which means they are consistently having to mention how awful women are in order for us to preserve the terms of praise for the groups. Now, this is what I mean by structure. It's a matter of seeing how the negative stereotype became necessary. So our first chapter was how essential is femininity, which in English is a bit of a joke to say, is femininity essential, which is what all feminists say. No, 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 it's not essential, but it is essential in the discourse of art history to acknowledge this, as it were, this mountain of art made by women in every age and every presence. So you let just a little bit in and the rest you label as absolutely negative, so that the feminine becomes the term for negativity, for lack. Okay. Now, Women in Art, as you can see here, was a study of visual representation by all artists sort of down the ages, women as well as men, focusing on the meanings attached to and signified in art in terms of the axes of power Now, Giovanna mentioned that I introduced gender. I'm not a gender theorist. I do not use the word gender except as it was originally used by certain anthropologists as an axis of power. Just as no one is born into a class and doesn't have a class, you can't have a gender. You're born into an arrangement, a hierarchical arrangement of power. This is the great lesson of structuralism. So the terms, the axes of gender and power were defined by law, controlling, for instance, marriage, divorce, by theology, the notions of what is a sin and not sinful and what the bodies can do, ideology, and then the socio-historical transformation of socio-economic systems over history. So Rosenau also drew upon the most ancient, as you can see from her cover, the most created ancient images ever created, 35 to 40,000 years before the Common Era. And then she juxtaposed this image of a mature woman with a work from 1937 by the British sculptor Barbara Hepworth, which is called Single Form. And she juxtaposed them on her cover because you can just see that this is not a phallic form because it rises, one face of it has a little fullness, such as women carry around in their bodies mostly. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the discovery of the Willendorf figure had occurred only in 1908. It was excavated, the first big work of this era to be excavated. And this is obviously the moment when modernist art is searching for a pre-classical or non-classical or non-Western resources for the transformation of the largely classical Christian traditions of Western art. So this is not from the ancient time to the present, it's a collision in time as the transformation, which is why we come to that. Now, we get back to this one. La Pensée. This is included in the book. It is a large block of roughly cut marble from which emerges a finely sculpted head. And here, this is the illustration in her book. And it was a postcard that she bought from the Musée Luxembourg in 1911, which indicates it was already in currency. And of course, the person whose head you see is another sculptor, Camille Claudel, whom you can see working up there, doing her own carvings, and you have examples of her work there. But this is not a portrait of Camille Claudel. She's not modeling as a woman. Rodin is the sculptor of this piece, represents the act of thinking, embodied, but only in the realized head and face that endows the abstract concept of thinking with the sense of a person and a specific person. It endows this woman with an identity, even were we not to know the facts about whose face has been studied and first created in plaster and later carved. The practicien Victor Peter, according to legend, did not proceed with delivering the head from beyond delivering the head from the block. Apparently, he paused to consult Rodin as to how he should continue. Apparently, Rodin suspended the carving. But this is the legend. It's not true, because when critic Paul Gessel visited the studio of Rodin in 1911, he encountered the original moulage, because all sculpture starts with a plaster formation and then it gets carved by somebody else, which is partly why I wanted to show you that Camille Claudel is carving. Rodin never carved a single piece of his work, but she did. So that's important, okay. Anyway, but when Paul Gessel visited, he's a critic, visited Rodin's studio and saw the moulage, he was horrified. What he saw was a woman imprisoned in matière, barely emerging from formless materiality. He imagined her missing body, as of course you would, twisted in unseen torment, deprived of movement and the possibility for action. But Rodin replied, "What are you reproaching me for?" he said with astonishment. It's by design. Believe me that I have left my statue like this. It represents meditation. This is why it has neither arms with which to take action nor legs with which to walk. Have you not noticed, in fact, that reflection, when at its deepest, justifies arguments for opposing decisions, such that reflection counsels inertia? So kind of pause, since because you battle with different possibilities before you take action. He then says Gusell, the critic, that the woman I then understood was the emblem of human intelligence that has been urgently agitated by problems it cannot resolve, haunted by an ideal it cannot realize, obsessed by an infinite it cannot embrace. I think that's a beautiful discussion or description of feminism. I'll read it again. We are agitated by problems we cannot yet resolve. We are haunted by an ideal we cannot realize and obsessed by an infinite that we cannot yet embrace. Rodin's sculpture, however, disembodies thought, perhaps all the better to make us perceive thought in the feminine, or féminin, as well as in the masculine. When we look at his monumental sculpture of Dante contemplating the circles of hell, modeled in 1880 and cast in bronze in 1904, Rodin creates a classical heroic figure, the tradition of a singular muscular individual male body, whose pose conveys the effort and burden. He's bent over with the task of thinking, but in fact, he's not thinking, he's witnessing the sinful world of humanity, because the figure, of course, is Dante. Now, La Pensée was originally titled Thought Emerging from Matter. It uses the allegorical feminine to create an image for thought. Rodin's sculpture was being created in a moment of cultural engagement across Europe with fervent anti-materialism, and this led to engagements, as we know, which are part of the symbolist moment, with the idealist philosophies of Emanuel Swedenborg and Thomas Carlyle. But we also found a different kind of materialism, which is related to what I'm saying, in the writing of Henri Bergson and also Sigmund Freud. Now, the question of how we can think and then aesthetically and materially embody the puzzle of the body-mind, or the psyche, the body-psyche, was answered by both Freud and Bergson in different ways. And in Matière et Mémoire, 1896, Bergson countered the radical distinction between the materiality of the body as a merely functioning nervous system to understand the body as understand memory as a pause. So we are living creatures, and everything that cuts you or touches you makes the body react. That's the functioning nervous system. But Bergson argued that what happens is our spinal cortex grows and then buds into this great, huge memory bank, which collects all the responses, and instead of immediately responding as the reflex, stores all this information as what he called image, and then out of that store, we make decisions. So the crucial thing that constitutes memory is this storing and delay, and then the possibility. Now this he calls virtuality, which I'm suggesting is very similar to the Rodin notion, that this sense of an inertia as you assemble possibilities for action. This is why we are thinking people, not because we have a spirit breathed into us, and go back to all your 18th century, 16th century philosophers trying to work out how the body-mind works. Bergson offered a very important one, which obviously was widely read by the artists of this particular period, including our friend Rodin. So I'm trying to suggest here how an image of thought can be produced in the sculptural material, what lies behind it. Now, when we get to Rosenau's choice of putting this sculpture by Rodin in her book, she puts it in the context of a history of women as revolutionary thinkers. This great long tradition from the classical period through the Middle Ages, through the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century. So if you look at her montage on the page, we have, in fact, Ferrand de Méricourt, on the one hand, one of the sacrificed, the executed women revolutionaries, and also persecuted in terms of treating her as mad. But you also have a working class woman invading the mining industry, and you have a juxtaposition around it of another form of inscription of femininity that we would, many people do not understand, is inscribed with ethnic identity, Marie Laurencin, as well as it's been a wonderful recent exhibition of Laurencin and her sisters, a queer reading of the lesbian community around Marie Laurencin to introduce you. But also we have Laurencin, and we have also the queer German philosopher, not by the philosopher, sculptor, René Saint-Denis, in her particular exploration of her self-portrait. So this kind of art history, which is not a sequence, but a montage that enables us to keep situating the question of women's thought. And over here you have Schopenhauer, one of the great misogynist thinkers, who is going to, as it were, being inverted because this is a sculpture by a woman sculptor by Elizabeth Ney, who is the only woman Schopenhauer agreed to be in a room with. And it is in this context that La Pensée was there. So what I've been trying to show you is an example of the sort of kind of archaeology I had to do to make sense of a little book that appeared with no context for me to situate it and to begin to read the kinds of logic, the kind of research that Helen Rosenau had done to make this, what this image, this as she's got there, take its place, rather than women artists or trying to integrate them in styles, but again, multiple strands that come together. And then when you come back to think what I've been saying about La Pensée, you have a kind of shimmer of all sorts of dimensions of women's presence and thought around it. So finally, the crucial thing about this piece is therefore the singularity of each woman as thinker or artist is precisely what patriarchal culture finds it hard, if not impossible, to imagine or recognize. Hence, we all become collectives, feminist thinkers, women artists, with some rare exceptions of singular stardom that then stands for a progressively obscured mass of the rest of us. Now, Rosenau's contribution to feminist thought is to think through the analysis of image as a form of symbolic thought. And this term was put in place by Ernst Cassirer, whom you see on the left, a philosopher in the city of Hamburg, who's surrounded here by his mates, his great friends. You can recognize Arby Warburg in the middle, Max Warburg, who was the brother who took over the bank, so he could become this, Erwin Panofsky. Now, and this lovely book called The Dreamland of Humanists identifies the Warburg school of art historical and philosophical thinking with these men. So I'm going to replace the banker with Helen Rosenau, and it's going to be not a quartet of men, it's going to be her. And while Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic form, Arby Warburg's art as a pathos formula, you see what I've been trying to do, showing you these pages. Erwin Panofsky, who had just arrived in Hamburg with his PhD and his habilitation, who was Rosenau's doctoral supervisor, right? So here we have another kind of rewriting of feminist thought into the histories of our discipline. Now, symbolic thought is not therefore iconography, which is what Panofsky was with, not just the pathos formula, but we have to have a way in which we understand images as combining both, as it were, the jeu d'esprit, the effort of thought, the discovery of the possibility something could take on a form, but also that must have an affect. Rosenau, her book, is a product of a long, also critical but effaced moment and indeed tradition of feminist thought that, as I've said, reached back into the ancient world as far as the Western world has been and beyond in other cultures, and was still vibrant in the late 19th, early 20th century. If Rosenau's brilliant writing and subsequent erasure indicate the depth of the crimes that have been committed against women and some men, that has since been performed by institutionalized masculinist thought since the middle of the 20th century, I can indict the universities as well as the museums and most of the art historians of the 20th century and to this day as instruments of systematic disinformation and worse, ideologically motivated mendacity. There's no difficulty in finding any of these things, but if you lie and say they don't exist, you have performed an act of motivated mendacity. Not only have generations of women and men been presented with versions of their past in art and all forms of thought that are totally incomplete and distorted, but this effacement has sustained and created the arrogance of men as the sole creators and thinkers, and this has produced a form of arrogant humanity called men. Now, those of you of the male sex in the room, I'm not a man-hating feminist, but I think it has to be said because most feminists spend their lives asking themselves, what are women? Who are women? Should we have any investment in women? Okay, we do women's studies, we do all of this, but nobody asks themselves, how did this figure get created? And men get created by negating women. The structural argument happens over and over again. The effacement has created this, but it is by such suppression of women that men emerge as the sole representatives of thinking and creative humanity. The suppression of women thus creates the idea of men, and that is why the exclusion of women has to be systematic and continues despite what Rosenau did in 1944 and what Rosie Parker and our whole generation did 50 years ago. I am tired to death of going to exhibitions where they say to me, oh, Griselda, you're going to be so excited. There's another exhibition of women artists who've been rediscovered, right? And they're collectivized. You go to an exhibition, they're never contextualized. Nobody tells you there's a massive difference between a Baroque 17th century Catholic from Florence and even a 16th century queer Catholic from, he was also from Florence. No, she was from Rome. Gentileschi's from Rome. I mean, Rome. All of these issues that are absolutely the sort of the texture of every system, what it matters, all these backgrounds matters, all these questions of age, questions of ability of their bodies. I mean, we know certain things to like Michelangelo, of course, because everybody knows certain things about Michelangelo, but nobody mobilizes them to an effect to transform our understanding of queer men, of queer Catholics, for goodness sake. You know, in terms of the situation, it's always brought into being historically situated in a discourse of art history that is to prove that this is a representative of these critical creative individuals. So you erase things. So now we're in the situation where I have to say I'm a feminist, post-colonial, queer, internationalist, feminist art historian, just to kind of encompass all the groups who are disappeared out of an art history that talks about men. So do not take this personally, but this is a challenge, just as we are challenging the normalization of whiteness, the normalization of heterosexuality. We always have to put an adjective for anything that doesn't do, and it's the adjective that reveals. The one without the adjective is claiming a space of unqualified normality. Okay, so we can go beyond this now. One moment, okay. So what we need to do is to produce a feminist effect. We don't need feminist art historians. We do need feminist art historians, but we don't need them labeled such. We need thinkers. We need feminist thought, and we don't want to be set apart. So people very politely do notice that I do things, but the question of where the work is read, where the work is mentioned, it's as if if I do it and we all women do it, somebody else called men do not have to do the studying in the same way about the creation of these hierarchies of difference. So I'm interested in how did Rosenau create a form of writing from her moment in the intellectual history of art history as an act whose effect was feminist. We need feminist effect. And Rosenau mobilized two theoretical propositions: art as a symbolic thought, proposed by Cassira, the image as a conveyor of pathos by Warburg. So we can approach art not as whether it is of this style or it was any good. We want to know what it is doing. And for that purpose, I've been mobilizing an expanded range of theoretical resources to produce feminist effects, what I call feminist interventions in arts histories, acknowledging that they are constantly plural. Now, I think I've talked about virtuality. So I now want to conclude with this one thing. I'm going to stop in this one. Feminism is a virtuality. It contests patriarchy, which is the socioeconomic cultural system, and phallocentrism, which is a psycholinguistic system. If we don't get these two things together, and you will think, how rarely do we use it? Only certain kind of feminist discourses name the system. If you're a Marxist, you don't have any embarrassment at talking about it, capitalism, right? If you're working in queer studies, you have no embarrassment about using the word heteronormativity. But the minute we say this is the system and it's patriarchy, you fall back into a kind of small corner where you're allowed to be a sort of slightly embarrassing sort of feminist anthropologist. And if you deal with phallocentrism, they just think you're being rude in terms of using words. So I want to remind you that there's another lost feminist art historian, which I have to say was not on my agenda either for many years, Françoise de Bonne, 1920 to 2005, just the other day. She was not lost. And she wrote one of the most important books in 1974 called Le Féminisme ou la Mort, which is the founding text of ecofeminism. And she links concern with the planetary the concern with the planetary survival with the treatment of women and the treatment of animals. She then had to do the excavation. She wrote Les Femmes avant le patriarcat, using that term, which has not become normalized again, and then really got into very serious work as an art historian in L'histoire de l'art et la lutte des sexes. She doesn't use the genre, which is a study of it's a beautiful, interesting reading. If you want it, I'm not going to summarize it because it comes out in the language. But she is the co-founder of the Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire. She was a Marxist, she was a feminist, and she argued the following. I'm just going to have to read this very quickly. De Bonne's analysis was built on a long tradition of research into the origins of socioeconomic systems that reach back into the emergence of anthropology and historical materialist analysis in the 19th century. She quotes Engels on private property and the origin of the family, and draws particularly on Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist who in the drew on Marcel Mauss, who saw the lovely patriarchy of Levi-Strauss and Durkheim and then Marcel Mauss. But Mauss put forward the theory of the bond created in society. The social bond is created by the gift. Because if you give something to somebody, they probably will either kill you or give you a gift in return and then not kill you. Right? That's the proposition. It seems tragic, but it is the one. So in one of the most brilliant texts of feminist and queer anthropology that built on this, Gail Rubin, a student of anthropology at the time, correlated Levi-Strauss's theory of society as a communication system by means of exchange with Saussurean semiotics and French and Lacanian psychoanalysis. So how does a system that forms the social bonds become, in a sense, the psychomental system within which we arrive? And this will get us back to who are the men. Because these rules of the internalization, the rules of kinship, via both the unconscious and the imaginary, is a demonstration of how socially and psychically two categories of human being have been invented, men and women, equally having its effect, which equally has the effect of erasing same-sex desire, or so we're outlawing it. These words, men and women, name positions in a linguistic economic system. The two positions signify the creation of two kinds of people, those who do the exchanging and those who are exchanged. If you are the object of exchange, you do not occupy the active position of receiving or making the exchanges. So when I ask why are there men, I turned to this analysis to say these are linguistic psychosexual positions produced once we accept that the formation of society is a bond of exchange. And this, of course, puts many of us in massive jeopardy and indeed misery in which women and the gender-defying others of the world live. It's true that many men live in jeopardy through the cruelty of capitalist economic forces, the legacies of colonialism, institutionalized racism, and theologically and legally sanctioned homophobia, as well as the dangers of living in a military or otherwise totalitarianism. But they do not do so as men, those who suffer. They do so because they are poor or black or queer or trans or workers or non-citizens. They are demeaned in relation to the privileged category of men. So we've now escaped, not all men are this, but we are caught up in this system, can have its internal differentiations. Now, Marxism can elucidate the formations of class and colonialism that reshape all humanity into those who have and who have not. But a working class person is not born thus, but is positioned thus by the capitalist system of production. A woman is not born, but is positioned thus by a patriarchal system of exchange, which is also a system for producing children who become the currency of exchange. Hence the intense concern of patriarchal societies to control or regulate the bodies and sexualities, and the bodies and sexualities of everybody, and the reproductive obligations of women. Hence also the central plank of feminist politics, which is that women must have control of their own bodies. And perhaps too, this will relieve the creation of a phobia around sexualities that do not have reproductive profit. So masculinity and femininity have to be psychosocially created by rendering the necessarily different but structural roles in sexual reproduction the conditions of access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to quote a famous and destroyed US Constitution. To analyze this construction and its tenacity in the face of 7 centuries of feminist process, we needed additional theoretical resources that draw together the system of kinship with the acquisition of language, the founding of the speaking subjectivity. And when we analyze language, we discovered that many languages do encode sexual difference, and art has been one of them. So this is not a reflection, it's a systematic encoding of this deep structure that Levi-Strauss have revealed to us of kinship, because children are the currency. And the wonderful post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak names this the uterine economy, which has to suppress women's sexuality in order to harvest children from their bodies for the purposes of having children to perform the exchanges. Now, we don't do exchanging much these days, but just try analyzing cinema or any form of popular culture, and you will find the narrative structures repeatedly involve these positionings and the discardings and who is going to be. It's a very interesting exercise. Now, you can see, therefore, why my books have a very complicated bibliography, just as also, okay, the dystopic present has taken place. No, sorry, this has come back. So we're just coming to the final point, which I wanted to make, which is, I wanted to talk about the Enlightenment. I wanted to talk about the origins of the critical humanities, of this exercise of thought and analysis. And so I went back to Kant and the famous aude sapere, dare to know. So I have dared to know. That's what feminist thought is. I have dared to know for myself and joined all these other women who've been doing so. And I found very fascinated that when Kant's famous What is Enlightenment was discussed by the wonderful Michel Foucault, his example of the concept of modernity that Kant gives us is exemplified by Charles Baudelaire, and particularly his essay, Le Peintre de la, what's it called? The Painter of Modern Life, de la Vie Moderne, okay? A text which was used in one of the moments of revelation in my own writing in an essay called Modernity and the Spaces of, Femininity and the Spaces of Modernity. How in the 19th century did an image of the modern city get created on the axis of not men in public and women in private, but on the commerce in women's sexual bodies. The line that divides the work of all the male impressionists and female impressionists is nothing to do with the public and the private zone. It's to how privileged men, bourgeois men, use women who are for commercial acquisition of their bodies. So I was fascinated in this, but Baudelaire for Foucault is a critical observer. And I want us to be a critical observer of modernity. So I'm going to draw in a final piece of feminist thought, which is the Italian Arendtian philosopher Adriana Cavarero. I'm sure the Italians amongst you will be clapping your hands, one of the wonderful, brilliant thinkers who is deeply influenced by things. And I'm going to end with this particular painting, which is on the cover of her book, Inclinations. This is a marvelous exercise in feminist thinking, which starts with Plato. The original of masculinist thinking is the moment that the philosopher stands up in the famous allegory of the cave. And she traces this figure of rectitude, which is like erectitude, rectitude. She's very politely playing around with this, but the figure of postural geometry, which is singular, which is alone, which is the figure of the masculine in this tradition that runs all the way from Plato to Levinas. But she interrupts it with a study of this painting by Leonardo, which just disappeared again. It'll come back. I'm sure you know it very well, because she's fascinated with a kind of counter geometry. Now, the dangers of this obviously are, in one sense, that we're reinstituting a model of the rectitude of the single man, who can be massed into many men, but they're all identical in one sense, to the question of the maternal. But this is not about the maternal. This is about a politics of the gesture, of a relationality, which is expressed in the fact of the axis of this work, which is on the different kind of crosses. So the mother reaches to protect the little child as it's just trying to jump onto the lamb, which is all the allegory that it's going to be the figure of sacrifice. And this is why one has to read it in terms of Catholic theology. The mother is always miserable. The virgin is always miserable because she knows her son is destined to die. The child is also miserable because it's trying to be bold and know it has to die. But here you have this moment of breaking that hieratic solidity that the virgin has as a body on which the child can stand, to break it, and the child turns around and you have the reciprocity of the gazes, but you also have the other gaze. You have the third gaze of the mother of the mother. So this is not a maternalist painting, but this is in a sense a geometry of possible relationalities, which are not based on the multitude of single upright figures, this massing of men. The same painting is very interesting because although it's not charged with a lot of sexual specificity, obviously, even though seeing the penis of the little Jesus that Leah Steinberg showed us is to show that he isn't divine, he's destined to die. That's why we always have to expose his sex. It's not Italians being very free with bodies. The reason that the baby Jesus is always so clearly masculinized is this is he has been born into the cycle of life and death. He's not divine. But here I think the ways in which Leonardo has placed the splayed feet and the opened knees, these figures of the female, unconsciously represents, as it were, the fact that we come into life in traditions of other people who have brought somebody else into life. And that's one of the great missing parts of our feminist thought, which I have written extensively about, which is why I've introduced Bracha Ettinger and her, who's an artist, but also has theorized a way in which we can imagine not men, women, and not this one and the other, but a sense of what is the linkages that exist within us all by having been carried into life, and what that deposits within us at a psychosexual level, not as motherhood as we understand it, but of connectivities that could be mobilized in undoing the kind of one or otherness of the phallic model. And I want to just end now with this one other piece. This is Bracha, these are her paintings, which of course are to do with the deepest crime of genocide, and particularly the last great genocide in the middle of the 20th century in Europe, which is to kill women and children. Why must they be the ones who were so systematically killed? Because there could not be a future. You don't just kill en masse, you systematically kill those who carry or could carry. And these are the works. So this led me into what Giovanna also mentioned, not only the arena of studying trauma and images relating to the after effects of traumatic events, but also exploring a different kind of Kantian tradition of sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who tried to understand how it was that the Holocaust, and indeed other genocides that we can think of, are the products of the logic of modernity. They're not aberrations. Because he argued that modernity is a gardening society, came up with the idea that you could have good, healthy plants and you could have bad plants. You can have weeds. They're called migrants. They're called queers. Less so than women, but they kill them nonetheless. So the idea is that a society, this is not an aberration, the horrors that we see, but a part of a logic, which is an anti-life logic of a certain sort, and appropriating sociologically and politically the right to decide who has a right to life, a full life, a human life. And if you think of most of the terms that we are concerned about in terms of people, is that they are living human beings, but do not have the right to a human life, right? And we have those different names. But he was inspired by a feminist thinker who wrote a book about her memories of being as a teenager in the ghetto of the Warsaw ghetto, and she survived, and she was saved by escaping and hiding in the countryside, where a Polish Catholic woman gave her refuge. Now, this woman was typical of someone of her class and background, who once said to Janina, "We can probably give you a hat and they won't see your Jewish hair. We can possibly put sunglasses on you and we won't see your Jewish eyes. But what am I going to do about your Jewish legs?" You think, okay, so what mentality? But this, of course, is, in a sense, what this process of demonizing other people are. But what Janina learned from this book, she said, "My book is meant as a tribute to those innumerable people who helped me and my mother and my sister to survive. The majority of them were women of different social backgrounds, ages, and occupations. The motives for risking their lives to help us were as varied as their characters. But during the war, I learned the truth we usually choose to leave unsaid, that the cruelest thing about cruelty is that it dehumanizes its victims before it destroys them, and that the hardest of struggles is to remain human in inhuman conditions." Now, if we live in the kind of society we live in, I think that's our struggle, to remain human in inhuman conditions and not, in a sense, to inflict it on the myriads of people that are afflicted by this. So I think we're done with that. I want to argue that if cruelty dehumanizes the perpetrator as much as the victim, and patriarchy is a systematic violence against women, we have to analyze the formation of those who do not each or at all individually destroy women, but collectively, by maintaining the system, reduce the humanity of women. On the enormous scale of physical and sexual violence that women experience and daily fear, the failure to include women as artists or to read, teach, and absorb feminist thought might seem a petty crime. But crime it is, since it is systematic, and the perpetrators make it women's business alone to challenge it. Thus, we have to move to a co-creating of human beings and not let it be sidelined into a job that you can leave to the women. And just finally, the problem I think we have now is we have a new enemy, not, I've lost it now, not simply the problem, but we have the enemy that is AI. I think critical humanities is in such a crisis, it's become critical, because the nature of thinking that involves difficult reading and difficult thinking, and doing what I've tried to do is to play with both your emotions and words, is something that is being taken from young people, probably not all of you, because you got to the stage that you're sitting here with MAs and PhDs and your teaching positions, that you are not affected by it. But for students going through university now, where it is possible that someone is recording this lecture, can put it through AI and come up with probably a more or less okay reproduction of what I've said, without it passing in any way through the language, the problems of language and thought. And I defend the difficulty of thought and the difficulty of language. And I think I'm terrified at the situation that we're in, where we have a truth is what gets the maximum life. There is no form of verification or scholarly countenance, as it were, countering that can stop the accumulation of misinformation. So if I'm indicting the existing old world of crimes against women, I think we can see what has happened with the correlation between the platform, I mean, with the technology, the internet, the platform, which is the World Wide Web, the social media now, and AI. These pose a deep threat to any form of thinking, because they are business models, they are crowdsourced, they are means of making vast amounts of money, and the last thing they have on their mind is justice, equality, or peace. So that's why it's very dystopic, but thank you.
I'm sorry for the technical problems at the beginning, but I wasn't able to fix it. But yeah, okay. Je pense qu'on a une bonne demi-heure pour des questions, pour une discussion. Et il est tout à fait possible de poser des questions en français.
Oui, c'est vrai.
Hein? Et on peut faire un peu dans les deux langues, selon la langue dans laquelle on est plus à l'aise.
Oui. Alors, je vois.
Oui. Alors, peut-être je peux commencer avec une première question pour lancer. Oui. En attendant que c'était une conférence qui était très dense, avec, je pense, énormément de matière que vous nous avez fournie pour réfléchir à différents aspects, notamment le croisement entre l'art, les arts visuels. C'est un domaine que, bon, pas ici parce qu'on est à l'université, mais qu'on a tendance à penser comme un domaine un peu en dehors des questions idéologiques et de politique, et donc de voir comment, au contraire, les arts visuels sont imbriqués avec les structures de pouvoir. Et en fait, peut-être c'est juste une petite question sur la conclusion, où il y avait cette relation entre la question de la déshumanisation, et je pense qu'on est dans une situation aujourd'hui où cette question se pose de façon urgente par rapport au conflit en cours, et la question des machines, hein, de l'intelligence artificielle que tu as juste évoquée brièvement. Et je voulais savoir si ça, c'est une question sur laquelle, qui sera développée, sur laquelle tu commences à réfléchir pour de nouvelles lignes de recherche. C'est un début, juste pour un peu te stimuler là-dessus sur ta conclusion. Voilà.
Alors, c'est la même situation qu'en commençant avec les études dans les petites collectives. Je suis dans une petite groupe qui lit des livres parce que nous sommes des femmes toujours jeunes mais assez âgées. C'était une problématique. Enfin, on est confronté à cette situation qui était Alors, il y a 5 ans, c'était pas une difficulté quand je suis toujours à l'université. Et quand j'enseigne, c'était pas encore un problème, mais pendant alors, les années précédentes, ça devenait quelque chose beaucoup très plus en plus difficile avec la transformation de la machine learning, l'intelligence. Et donc, alors, je suis en train de lire un livre par un Américain, un historien qui s'appelle Jason Steinhauer. Et le livre ça s'appelle History Disrupted. Et c'est une étude avec plusieurs petites études sur l'effet du monde électronique, mais aussi de social media, mais aussi de ces questions de AI, parce que c'est impossible de... Alors, toutes les... I'm going to say this in English, it's getting too complicated. All the protocols that we are taught to be historians, right, are challenged by the authority of the systems that enable opinions and information to go viral in such a way that you cannot counter them on the same platforms. So we maybe are able to write our difficult books and they sit dustily in the libraries, and maybe nice professors or less nice professors will impose on you the agony of having to read. I'm rereading Derrida's Différence at the moment for something else, and it is slow and painful, but that idea of grasping these things, which can come by work and usually work with other people. Each of us contributes a little bit, and slowly a picture can emerge. That's fine, but I'm in the process of trying to think this through, and these are the key terms that Steinbach comes up with, which is what happens to knowledge when it's crowdsourced. Its affirmation is based on the numbers of people. And the other thing is the structure of virality. So nothing we've ever had before was, you published a book and if you got a review, but we've got that. So you can see also who have become the academic stars, what kind of keywords have come. So for instance, gender has completely changed its meaning in terms of feminist thought in the last 5 years. It has a longer history, obviously going back to the early 1990s, but now that virality makes that the meaning. So I've tried to show you how in doing this lecture, I'm disturbing for instance, the notion of men and the notion of women, to try and let these words accumulate a different kind of history that layers them, that if we unpick it, we may be able to find space to breathe a kind of notion of not this men, women, but different kinds of humanities that we have to have, but not a humanity that's arrogant, because we are also, negotiating with the condition of life. I know Florida is about to be wiped off the map as we speak. I don't know, these hurricanes, most of, Herzegovina isn't there anymore. Most of, we're witnessing this. Hasn't happened to you in Geneva, but I know it's happened in Germany last year, this kind of question. These are huge issues, which we need the respect for thinking and for research and for evidence that we don't have. So I have no answers. I am just going to be the sort of, now my age is telling me, and it's late at night, the woman lying at the gate saying, I'm sorry, it's all going to be awful. It's all going to be awful, but it is awful because it's already been awful for millennia. And we need to conjugate these questions, because the critical humanities are the humanities. And if we are without the criticality of the humanities, we can't imagine being things, because there are many people who are, discussing the Anthropocene. That seems to have passed away a little bit, etc. But I always replied, I'm absolutely with the dogs and the horses, but I don't see them standing around in lecture theatres and worrying their heads about the situation of the world. So while I am all with the solidarity with the animals, and they should have absolute, respect, etc. We are the only ones who can do it because we have thought. And we have thought because we have language, and if language becomes corrupted to this extent, you're not going to have thought. So that's as far as I've got, which is the good news I've brought from Yorkshire.
Je trouve que ça, oui. Il y a un micro, en fait.
So thank you. First of all, actually, thank you for your very rich and very complex presentation. And I have a question regarding the reception of the work, both within academia and outside of it. I'm currently reading the book Curriculum Women by Conrad Working at the moment, which she talks about the fact that women have always, well, again, speaking of women as a difficult, but like some women have always like refused and resisted feminism and feminist thought. And have you, I'm guessing you've encountered a lot of hostility in like maybe the male part of academia, but how have women, again, I know it's complicated to exist in a collective like way to talk about people, but like how have women reacted to your work? Have some women been against it? How has it been within the, like I know you're in a lot of conversations with women artists, and how has your work been received by that part of it? How has women artists or artists who are women think about your work?
Thank you for that question. When Old Mistresses was published in an American edition in 1981, two very distinguished feminists disowned the book, one by saying it was eccentric and the other saying it was provoking. And of course, it does seem, I mean, I am provoking. That's important form of acting, is to say, what's she talking about? This is weird also, but you then have to think about it, and maybe you don't agree with my positions, but at least I've stirred up something by daring to say something. But in general, I would say you're absolutely right. There is no collectivity women, right? That's the primary thing. If we say, how have women, there are very right-wing, there are very left-wing, there are, there's the variety. Just as I wouldn't say, about, Kant, how did the men react to Kant? I mean, some obviously thought this was great, others didn't. The Hegelians would later say, oh, this is all not a bunch of nonsense, and then we go back. No, because we singularize things, okay? It's only women who bear this construction, which is why I was trying to reverse it and make it very uncomfortable for people by saying, why are there men, right? Because once we have this notion, what do women think? Okay, now Linda Nochlin is a liberal leftist Democrat, and she's a positivist, and much art history is positivist. That was the prevailing model, and that's what makes Rosenau interesting, because the dominant form of art history that has, so when you think Gombrich, that book has sold 13 million copies worldwide. It's in 30 languages, and it absolutely refuses any form of structural, philosophically based, linguistically based, critically based thinking. It says it's all about perception. It's all about individualism, right? Now, I don't say he is representative of every man. I say it's very significant. The two most anti-feminist books, and I'll change your question round, the two most anti-feminist books were written by two people who lived through the rise of fascism, even though they had to escape from it, right? And fascism is one of the most violent of the anti-feminist political systems that took over states, right? Just like certain religious fundamentalisms are deeply anti-feminist. So I think the question is that there are people here who are listening. They haven't walked out yet. I get royalty checks for £50, and sometimes I'm very lucky, about £200, whereas most people who are selling books get thousands, right? You know, most of the official books, I mean, you know, it's not a lot, but they are read. I think they are studied, but I think people find it very difficult to piece together the jigsaw, because there are so many resources that I have studied, but in reading groups. When I was a graduate student, we were reading Foucault in one group, we were reading Saussure in another. We went to weekends where people tried to help us with semiotics. We went to psychoanalysis. We didn't get taught it. We said, these are tools we need to think through the dilemmas that we face. So I think it's a matter of including women thinkers in the normal curriculum, because all of us need those tools if we are to sustain the others that we are for whom we are responsible, the planet and the animals, as well as keep some of us alive. I mean, this is a life and death issue. I mean, you know, every day I come home from my reading groups at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, and I measure the distance from where my car is parked to my house. Or I probably phone the house and say, I'm just walking that distance still, right? Because I live opposite where one of the most heinous rapes and murders ever in the city I lived in took place. I went to university when women had to go home from university every day at 4 o'clock when it was still sunshine, and the university ran buses because none of us could not be accompanied home while the famous Yorkshire River was about. And that obviously is not everybody, not all men, you see, it's not collective, but it's an effect. It's a phallic effect which we have to counter. So I'm very grateful for the many students who find something in any of my books that make them think, oh, I'd like to do that. I'd like to think. I don't necessarily agree with Griselda, but I certainly want to do things like that. That's all I want to have happen.
Il y a d'autres questions? Oui, Ilana.
I was very surprised to hear that your book on distances was.
I can't hear, sorry.
I was surprised to hear that your book on distances was published in 1991 first, and then translated into French only in 2024. So I wanted to ask you if you would identify specific reasons explaining such a long delay, and it made me think of other foundational books in gender studies, like Gender Trouble, The Straight Mind, and Women Critique, who also, for which it took a long time to have translations. And I'm thinking of Women Critique, who said about The Straight Mind, which was first translated in 1992, first published, sorry, in 1992 in English, and then translated 10 years later in French, that she said it was unacceptable in French to talk about heterosexuality as a political regime. So my question would be, has it been unacceptable for to have feminist interventions in art history for so many decades in the French language, in France in particular?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know. It may be something Giovanna can say more about, as being somebody who helped to bring this about. You need a publisher, you need a translator, you need money, right? Money comes to those when you think things will be sold. And I think that creates, because publishing is a socioeconomic market, you know, it's a capitalist market. Most of my books, I mean, Old Mistresses was first commissioned by a young art historian who set up his own publishing house. He was an architectural historian. And when he went out of business, the books that in his list were sold to a pornographer who wanted the prestige of some art books to cover the real business. And we had to steal it back. Rosie and I had to steal it because in those days you had photographs that you had to buy. So that's what was the investment of the publisher, was paying for the images. So Rosie and I literally went to the factory and stole these things. The man sued us for £2,000, which is like £40,000 now. So neither Rosie and I have ever made any money from Old Mistresses because we're constantly paying back the publisher that took it on, Routledge. And that was because a very wonderful feminist editor said, I'll rescue it and I'll find £2,000 to get that book back. So, I mean, there's behind every one of these is that, you know, these combinations. And to say, I mean, that Of Mistresses is in Spanish, 2022, but it was translated into Japanese way back by Hagiwara Hiroko, who is one of the most brilliant feminists in the world and a very major teacher of mine, who does the work of translation, because it's a huge job. And I think that Wittig, I find that absolutely fascinating, except the same thing is the feminist world has accepted stars and it isn't equal. So for me, Gender Trouble arrived 1990. Within 2 days, every single one of my students was a Butlerian. And I've never understood it. They had all these other resources, Judith Butler. It was just, it hit a nerve because they didn't want to have to do this other stuff, right? It's all done for you in a certain wonderful Hegelian way, but all this other kind of stuff that I'm struggling with takes a lot of time. And so I don't know, I have to thank those who do the translations. They're mostly, I owe everything to other women who do the work or find the publisher or make it happen. And mostly, I have to say, I have to find the funds, which is why getting prizes is very nice, because it costs an enormous amount to publish an art history book. I mean, for Women in Art, the cost of the illustrations was £8,000. And without the illustrations, there isn't a book. So I think these are really important issues that you've raised about who or why gets taken up and made into some kind of must read. And that's what I feel, this huge field of feminist thought, because we talked last night about Teresa de Lauretis. Why Judith Butler, not Teresa de Lauretis, who's a very sophisticated analyst of all the things that need to be analyzed. So it's, don't be an art historian, it's expensive.
Thank you. Une autre question?
We have the questions. Okay, so I was really touched by the letter you showed and read and shared with us by Jessica Parker, because I think it's really an object and the moment that crystallizes the realization of the political projects you were embarking on. And I wonder why it took the form of a letter, like what did your exchange look like, and when did this letter come about in the process of thinking and working and writing together? And if you would say something more about this.
I just have to say that writing with other people, working with other people is extraordinarily important and good. I mean, so I have collaborated not only with Rosie Parker, I did a lot of writing with Fred Orton, who's an art historian specialist like me on Van Gogh, but also on, we used to teach together a course on the 1950s in New York, just when people were beginning to put together this way back in the 70s. I then did a long project with Max Silverman on the concentrationary, and the thing that why I quoted this letter was this, instead of the idea of the individual thinker, which produces the academic star system, most of us learn what we're doing by teaching, because you arrive in a class and you think, I have no idea what this text is like. I'll give you an example. I was teaching Gayatri Spivak's, it wasn't the Rani of Samoa, it was Can the Subaltern Speak? I have no idea what that text was about. So I thought what we'll do is we'll just go around the room and ask each person to make a contribution. Did you find anything interesting? Was there anything provoking? Could you? And eventually we had this huge map, 10, 15 people. And we said, okay, now we see, because it's not like, oh, I can understand this. These are very difficult things, but we worked together, and slowly we said, by the end of the seminar, we have possibly each of us got one sentence which we can go away and do something with. And maybe you'll go back to the text and there'll be another sentence that will enable you to go away and do something with it. But at the same time, when I had taught that class for 10 years, I was getting quite good at Spivak. I think I could probably give you an account of that, but I didn't just open the book and say, oh, yes, it's really, this is really challenging. And teaching is a way that you're always collectively learning, and everybody is contributing from their situation, from their embodiment, from what they bring, their ideas, their concerns. And that's why I had a section here, because you can see we'd be here all night, about the sort of Roland Barthes idea to the seminar, where you have the idea of the master, craftsman who shares his skills with the journeyman who does his piece and then gets to be a master. You have the idea that there is the authority who opens the mind of the student and fills it with the official knowledge and closes it and sends them off into the world. And then he says, a seminar has to be maternal, because you can't teach a child to walk, but you have to make it possible for the child to learn to walk. So you're not teaching anything, but you are enabling learning. So I think that's a crucial thing. I think Paulo Freire about the pedagogy of the oppressed means you have to create a safe learning space by acknowledging all the violence that potentially is in there in terms of class, race, and other normativities that are unacknowledged. So I always ask everybody to introduce themselves, but then that's also an imposition. Some people don't want to have to speak up. You don't want to say, I am. You might say, I want to share this with you. And slowly I realized you could not teach unless you created a safe learning space, but that meant, say, read a bit of bell hooks, listen to Audre Lorde, read something by Barthes, read some of these things and think about what is the process. And then you all learn from each other, even though I am responsible as the sort of chef de seminar for creating a kind of reasonable logic for the journey. So that's why I started with, what is the journey? It's always a journey. So I think we need these other kind of metaphors than the university gives us. And my entire formation is in collectives outside the university, because it was none of the universities were teaching us anything that we needed. But now it becomes, but I don't think it has become the curriculum. That's the point I'm making. It can come and go.
I really love this idea of learning as a collective process. I think this is so important in a university setting to highlight this point. And I also love the idea that you started your career with the collective project, with the Women's Art History Collective, and writing the book with Rosika Parker, and that you are talking about your current reading group now, where you want to learn about AI with your fellow participants. I think c'est un enseignement, je pense, pour nous aujourd'hui. Je ne sais pas s'il y a encore une dernière question. Oui. Et après, Ou avant-dernière aussi, hein, on a encore un peu de temps.
I have to come closer. I'm not sure I completely heard because of the problem of my hearing aids and the microphones, etc. So please correct me if I am wrong. But I'm thinking once you know that we are caught in a systemic attempt to continue the effacement, right? You then are already on this another way out. So my methodology has been case studies. Instead of producing surveys or groups, I do specific, deep, intense readings, like just that one work, La Pensée by Rodin, or one set of works. So my books don't look like art history books because they increasingly look like small exhibitions where I'm putting things together so that I can use the insights of the Warburg's Builder Atlas idea that there's a logic you can't see when you put images together. And then I'm trying to use particular logics so that it goes back to the point that Rosie made in her lecture about you have to see each artist and indeed each artwork in its singularity as what it's doing, how it's doing it. And that's why, you know, certain elements of being trained as an art historian are absolutely vital so that when you confront something you don't know, you say, you know, what am I seeing? How was it made? What was it made to do? What's it in dialogue with? And I don't know if this relates to the question in a sense directly, but that I would really say you just make yourself never use the phrase, well, I invented the English phrase artist women, artist men, because the minute I have to say woman, black, queer, trans, post-colonial, Indian, black, all of these things, the minute I put the adjective in front of the word artist, all those people are disqualified as artists because you have this word, which is by default occupied by the privileged other of all those terms. So how do we do that? And yet at the same time indicate this. Now, in French, obviously, when I was writing the lecture and translating into French, the translator kept coming up with Camille Claudel is sculptrice. Oh God, you know, okay, sculpteur, Rodin, sculptrice, that's fine, you've got a gender in your language, but etc. But even that ICE ending, you know, sculpteur, sculptrice. We all find it's already got a music of difference, which is already encoded in this thing. So it's like I'm Professor Emerita. Now in English, you don't put an E on the end of it. So the people in my university said, you can't be emerita, you have to be emeritus, because professor is a masculine noun. So I said, can I be professoressa emerita? No. Anyway, but you see what I mean? So that these questions of how critical we must be about every word we use be part of the system of inflicting these hierarchies, these axes of differentiation. And if we work on it together, you find doing things. So again, the last but one book I wrote called Killing Men, Dying Women, which I don't think has sold very well because of the title. People are a little worried about this title, but it's a joke. It's about Marilyn Monroe, Jackson Pollock, and Lee Krasner. And what would it be to be an artist if you're like Lee Krasner? If to be a woman in 1950s America is to be Marilyn Monroe, and to be an artist to be Jackson Pollock. Well, she's going to negotiate this force field, and it's triangulated. It's not Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner. It's a variety of modalities of being, and then you're going to find different things about Jackson Pollock, different things about Lee Krasner. You're going to explode the idea that it's, you know, a gender, or what I call the sort of sexual difference hierarchy. So I think the question is close reading, case studies, and then you mobilize different elements without turning everything you say about somebody into labels. You know, how does somebody's sexuality work in this instance in this way, instead of them being a representative of some other collective? And that has worked to make it great. I mean, I love doing it. I just had to do it this week recently I was asked, an artist from Guyana, who is a very famous British artist, but because obviously he's from the Caribbean, had only become very famous, and he's in his 90s now, even though he was there at all the stages and part of it all the way through this. So this happens in the same way, because he was a Black artist until there was a Black art movement. And then he said, but I'm not a Black artist. I'm an artist from Guyana who lived in London and painted in New York. And, you know, that's what matters, you know, those sorts of things. And then what is that work actually doing? Not because he's a Black artist, but how has he negotiated all the things he wanted to make art about in such a way that there are resonances that make me have to think about what it is to negotiate the world, but make fantastic paintings at the same time. So there's a methodology in art history that enables you, if you ask those questions, what am I seeing? How is it made? Why was it made? What was it made to do? Who was it made for? And then all this complexity comes out, and you haven't got caught in, this is a woman artist, this is just this artist. But all of that may be a factor in different ways. I hope that touches your question a little bit. I'm not sure. No.
Je pense que
On
on
va
va
finir.
remercier. Thank you so much.